Hello, I'm Africa 54 Managing Editor Vincent Makori in for #TheUWord. It's Thursday, October the 28th. This is Africa 54.
The African Union, the EU, the United States, and other nations are calling on Sudan's military leaders to return to the civilian-led transition to democracy as deposed Prime Minister Abdalla Hamdok is released from military custody. The AU says it plans to get up to 110 million doses of Moderna's COVID vaccine in a deal assisted by the White House, which is deferring U.S. Moderna vax deliveries so Africa has them. Pro-government Zimbabweans want an end to 2003 imposed sanctions against Harare by the United States and other nations, saying they're keeping the nation from achieving economic recovery. Those stories and much more on today's Africa 54.
We begin our broadcast in East Africa, where the leader of Sudan's military junta has fired at least 6 ambassadors from their posts after they spoke out against this week's overthrow of the joint civilian-military transitional government. State-run Sudan TV announced Thursday that General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan dismissed the envoys to the United States, European Union, China, Qatar, and France, as well as the head of Sudan's United Nations mission in Geneva. A group of Sudanese diplomats issued a joint statement this week condemning the arrest of Prime Minister Abdalla Hamdok and his wife on Monday, and General Burhan's decision to dissolve the Sovereign Council and declare a national emergency. In an interview with VOA, Sudan's now former ambassador to the U.S., Nur al-Din Sati, said he would try to undermine the junta. General Burhan says the military will relinquish power to a civilian government in July 2023 after general elections are held. Now, after the military takeover of the Sudanese government, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken spoke with deposed Prime Minister Abdalla Hamdok, who was released from custody Tuesday. The U.S. is calling for a return to the civilian-led transition to democracy. Here's VOA's senior diplomatic correspondent, Saine.
As pro-civilian government protesters in Sudan's capital blocked traffic with small brick barricades, the international community was swift to condemn this week's military takeover in Sudan. United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres.
I once again strongly condemned the forceful military takeover of power in Sudan. And I urge, of course, all stakeholders to exercise maximum restraint.
The U.S. Deputy Representative had this to say at a UN Security Council meeting on Sudan Wednesday.
As we have said repeatedly, any changes to the transitional government by force in Khartoum puts at risk U.S. assistance.
Sudan's leading general, Abdel Fattah Burhan, said he was dissolving the country's ruling Sovereign Council, as well as the government led by Prime Minister Abdalla Hamdok, in an effort, in his words, to preserve the path of the magnificent December Revolution until its final goals are achieved. But in Washington, State Department spokesperson Ned Price said the Sudanese military has subverted the democratic aspirations of the Sudanese people. He outlined U.S. goals in this situation, working with the international community.
An immediate release of all political actors detained in connection with these events, a full restoration of the civilian-led transitional government, and a refraining from any violence against peaceful protesters, including the use of live ammunition. And we strongly condemn recent reports of violence against peaceful protesters.
Secretary of State Antony Blinken called Prime Minister Hamdok late Tuesday, welcomed his release from custody, and emphasized U.S. support for the civilian-led transition to democracy. Diplomatic outreach in the region is exactly what is needed right now, Joseph Tucker of the U.S. Institute of Peace told VOA.
I hope there's engagement with Egypt because that's the crux of the matter, is that the military and those aligned with the military feel, again, whether explicit or not, that they do have the backing of the region. So that high-level U.S. government attention is critical.
The State Department has called on the Sudanese military to refrain from any violence against peaceful protesters, which includes not using live ammunition. Cindy Saine, VOA News.
A health ministry official says at least 7 people were killed by gunfire and 140 injured in clashes between soldiers and street protesters. Bryan Wood reports.
Global powers have condemned a military coup in Sudan and called on security forces to release those who were detained unlawfully. On Monday, the U.S. State Department released a joint statement co-signed by the UK and Norway. A department spokesperson added it was pausing $700 million in economic aid to Sudan after the country's military seized power from a transitional government earlier in the day. Clashes broke out Monday between soldiers and street protesters. A health official said several people were killed by gunfire. Al-Tayyib Mohammed Ahmed was among a crowd of young people who barricaded streets in protest.
They fired stun grenades, then they fired live ammunition. 2 people died. I saw them with my own eyes. Then they came back twice and killed 1 more. This is the 3rd one I saw.
Sudan had been on edge since a failed coup plot only a month before. Military and civilian groups have been sharing power following the toppling of autocrat leader Omar al-Bashir 2 years ago. The military was meant to hand over power to an elected figure in the coming months. But on Monday, coup leader General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan dissolved the Sovereign Council, declared a state of emergency, and promised to hand over power to an elected body in 2023.
We're stressing here that the armed forces intend to complete the democratic transition until the country's leadership is handed over to an elected civilian government who can bring these issues to life.
Sudan's information ministry said on Facebook that the transitional constitution only allows ousted Prime Minister Abdalla Hamdok to declare a state of emergency and called the military's actions a crime. The ministry said Hamdok was detained in an undisclosed location after refusing to support the takeover. Troops also arrested civilian members of the Sovereign Council, government officials, and the state TV news director, according to his family.
Well, Bryan Wood of Reuters filed that report. For the latest on Sudan, I'm joined live via Skype by VOA reporter Nabil Biagio, who has been closely following the developments in his native country. Nabil, thanks for joining us. First, there are reports that state officials in Khartoum are vowing disobedience and activists are organizing mass demonstrations for later this week. What more can you tell us?
Absolutely. It's a massive campaign of civil disobedience, which includes state officials, members of the cabinet that General al-Burhan dissolved, which includes ministers, including the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mariam al-Sadiq, but also across professions. We've seen doctors, even oil workers, participating in this campaign of this process of civil disobedience. Beside the streets, the protests on the streets, which began Monday before even the military takeover was officially announced, since reports of the detention of Prime Minister Abdalla Hamdok and several members of his cabinet came out, the protests started.
Yeah. Now, we see protests on the streets, but what can you tell us about people's day-to-day life? What are you hearing from the ground?
The people I speak with in Khartoum, including family and friends, what is happening in Khartoum right now and across Sudan, people protest mostly in the evenings, at night, Someone in Khartoum told me, life is so hard, we can't afford to go a day without, working, because people live, from hand to mouth. The economic conditions are not good. But nonetheless, they have sustained their defiance of the military takeover from day one. And every single day they've been coming out to the streets, protesting, barricading roads, burning tires, even going into confrontations with security forces, and 7 have been reported killed, more than 100 injured. And there's a massive rally to what they call a march of millions, or million-person march, to take place on Saturday, which is expected to be a massive showdown between the street and the military rulers.
Yeah.
In Khartoum.
So despite a tough situation, even economically, they're pushing on. But here is another one. Prime Minister Hamdok, we hear, of course, he was released along with his wife. But what do we know about other civilians who have been detained, and why would they have been detained, if we know anything?
So a number of arrests were made right before the announcement of General Abdel Fattah al-Burhan that he was dissolving the government, including Prime Minister Abdalla Hamdok, his wife, and members of his cabinet, including the minister in his office, Khalid Omar Yusuf, and a civilian member of the Sovereign Council itself, which he dissolved, and notable figures like Yasser Arman, well-known, who was his advisor. And the wave of arrests didn't stop there. Even after the military takeover, several members of the Forces for Freedom and Change, which is basically the body behind the protests and that overthrew Bashir and now formed the government and brought Prime Minister Abdalla Hamdok. So the arrests were widespread and many, and we're reporting on this amid an internet and phone service shutdown. Phone services are severely restricted. There's an internet blackout in place. But we know several people have been arrested. Only Prime Minister Abdalla Hamdok and his wife were released. And Burhan said in his last press conference that some of those arrested would have criminal charges brought against them. So we don't know even if they intend to release them or not.
Well, thank you. It's interesting that they only arrest civilians, but not military fellows. Thank you very much, Nabil. That was VOA reporter Nabil Biagio updating us live via Skype on the situation in Sudan. Now, the African Union says it intends to buy up to 110 million doses of COVID-19 vaccines from Moderna in an arrangement brokered in part by the White House, which will defer delivery of some doses intended for the United States to facilitate that deal. Soraya Ali has the details.
The African Union will buy up to 110 million doses of the Moderna COVID-19 vaccine. The arrangement, which was brokered in part by the White House, will defer delivery of some doses intended for the United States to facilitate the deal. The AU's doses will be delivered over the coming months, with 15 million arriving before the end of 2021. AU coronavirus envoy Strive Masiyiwa said in an email, "We urge other vaccine-producing countries to follow the lead of the US government and give us similar access to buy this and other vaccines." He added that the Moderna purchase represented the first time the 55-member AU had secured vaccines that were not fully produced in Africa. Still, the new shipments of vaccines are well below what Africa needs to vaccinate its 1.3 billion people. The continent has had far less access to life-saving vaccines than more prosperous parts of the world. Moderna said it was working to make it possible to fill doses of its COVID-19 vaccine in Africa by 2023 and has plans to build a manufacturing plant on the continent. Last month, the AU accused COVID-19 vaccine manufacturers of denying African countries a fair chance to buy vaccines and urged manufacturing countries, in particular India, to lift export restrictions on vaccines and their components.
That was Soraya Early of Reuters reporting. Now to the south of the continent, pro-government Zimbabweans say sanctions imposed in 2003 and earlier by some Western nations, including the United States, because of election rigging and human rights abuses, derailing the country's economy, or rather the country's economic recovery. These sanctions are a divisive issue among Zimbabweans. Columbus Mavunga from Harare reports from Harare that the UN Special Rapporteur is assessing the impact of sanctions.
38-year-old Wengisa Imbayago is among those who have camped outside the U.S. Embassy in Harare in protest that have lasted nearly 3 years. He says he wants U.S. officials to take action now.
Our aim is that when the U.S. Embassy and its federal government remove sanctions imposed in Zimbabwe, then we can leave this place. The sanctions imposed on Zimbabwe have strained relations of the country with other countries worldwide.
The Labour Economist and African Democrats of Zimbabwe, an opposition political party, was one of the organizations that were initially for the sanctions, which targeted specific individuals and entities linked to the abuses. Now the party wants sanctions removed. Its leader, Linda Tsungirirai Masarira, says they are hurting ordinary Zimbabweans.
If indeed these sanctions were targeted, they missed the target because the 83 people they break data on the sanctions are living lavish lifestyles. They send their children to school in the diaspora. They go to the hospital anywhere in the world. They've got private jets. They are not affected anyhow by these sanctions.
The United States, Britain and the European Union in statements this week said Zimbabwe's economy was hurting because of corruption and government mismanagement of the country's resources, not sanctions. Still, the Zimbabwe Council of Churches says it is time for sanctions to be removed.
But we are also saying the issues that have resulted in these sanctions being imposed must also be addressed. All the issues being the human rights violations, our economy, our humanitarian situation.
Alena Dohan, a UN Special Rapporteur, has spent 2 weeks in Zimbabwe assessing the impact of the sanctions. The government of President Emmerson Mnangagwa has led the calls for protest, alleging Zimbabwe is being punished for the land reform program under the late President Robert Mugabe, which displaced white farmers. Columbus Mavunga for VOA News, Harare.
We are excited to hear what you think about Africa 54. Join the discussion on Facebook. The address is Africa 54. You're also streaming our broadcast live on Facebook. Please watch and share our show with your friends. Also, check out our headlines 24/7 at voaafrica.com. Still to come, we'll tell you which West African Agritech startup secured millions of dollars in seed money to drive the industrialization of food processing.
Health, wellness, sport, beauty, medical breakthroughs. Healthy Living cares about your well-being. What are the main health concerns in Africa and around the world? Find out the latest on coronavirus. Connect with our experts and ask them questions.
How long does the virus stay?
Join me, Linor Mudu, in Washington, every week on Healthy Living, right here on VOA.
Nigeria is losing thousands of doctors every year to Europe, North America and the Middle East due to poor salaries, benefits and working conditions at home. Nigerian health authorities are promising to improve compensation to stop the country's medical brain drain. But as Timothy Obiezu reports from Abuja, it may not be enough.
We didn't have the materials we needed to work with, so you would see people die from preventable diseases.
Nigerian doctor Chimezie Ibe recalls the poor state of Nigeria's health system. When he got an offer to work in Britain 2 months ago, he took it.
I left because I got frustrated. I worked in a place where I worked in an environment where for the first 4 months of my employment, I was owed. And in these 4 months, I had bills to pay, I had responsibilities to meet up to, I had to be at work every day.
Dr. Ibe is among the some 2,000 doctors Nigeria loses every year to better paying jobs abroad, according to the country's National Medical Association. Countries such as Britain, the United States, Saudi Arabia, and Canada are prime destinations. The association says poor funding, frequent strikes, overpay, and unfavorable government policies for the health sector are to blame for the medical brain drain. Money is not the only factor driving health professionals abroad, as Nigerian optometrist Ifeanyi Ugenyi explains.
I want to practice in an environment where I have basically all diagnostic tools at my disposal.
Payment disputes between the government and medical practitioners have continued for years and led to strikes, the latest being the National Association of Resident Doctors strike, which was suspended early this month, more than 2 months after it began. Nigeria's Medical Association blames the migration for Nigeria's falling doctor-to-patient ratio. But some doctors like Blessing Okubo refuse to leave.
Which I have had several opportunities to work abroad, but I still chose to strengthen my country and strengthen the health sector.
This month, Nigerian authorities promised to increase pay in a bid to retain physicians. But medical expert Ejike Orji says a broader approach is needed to ensure Nigerian doctors stay.
But our healthcare system is so broken that we need a lot of resources. And we need a lot of transparency and accountability to make use of even the little that we want to put in it.
Until then, thousands of Nigerian health professionals will continue trying to get a job abroad. Timothy Obiezu for VOA News, Abuja, Nigeria.
Well, Nigeria is one of the top producers of oil palm in the world. The business is highly lucrative and primarily dominated by small farmers, with 80% of the local market share. Recently, Relief, an Agritech startup that makes African farmers and food factories more efficient, secured $4.2 million in seed funding to drive the industrialization of food processing in Africa. Africa 54's technology correspondent Paul Ndiho spoke to Ikenna Nzewi, CEO and co-founder of Relief, which is based in Lagos.
Ikenna Nzewi, welcome to Africa 54.
Pleasure to be here.
You run a very successful agri-tech company in Lagos, Nigeria. You recently raised a ton of money. A lot of people would say that's great for a startup like yours. What are you likely to do going forward now that you are in the major leagues?
First, I'll start with our mission. So Relief's mandate is to industrialize food processing in Africa, and we do that by decentralizing factories. So we place a network of smart factories as close to smallholder farmers as possible so that we can reduce post-harvest loss, employ better technology to increase processing yields, and pay more of the capital or the value back to farmers. So because our factories are closer to the farmers, their money doesn't get eaten up by logistics costs that we then have to bear. And so we're focused on redefining what food processing on the continent looks like, and bringing better technology closer to farmers so that farmers can focus on production and factories can focus on processing.
When you talk about farmers, what kind of farmers are you focusing on?
We focus exclusively in the oil palm sector today and within Nigeria. So the vegetable oil market in Nigeria is $3 billion. And importation of vegetable oil has been banned by the government to basically create a conducive environment for the domestic market to become stronger and for it to become an employer of people. And so we see an immense opportunity to help smallholders increase their yields. While Nigeria is the largest oil palm producer that comes from smallholder farmers in the world, Nigeria also has the worst yields per hectare or per unit of land. And so there's an immense opportunity to take this country that has this natural resource widespread and to increase our production efficiency.
When you talk to some of these farmers that you are targeting, what are their concerns? How do they overcome some of the challenges that have been impacting their small businesses?
We started financing our farmers in March to basically enable them to increase their yield rates and to provide us with more raw material. Farmers understand that logistics are difficult, and so with that in mind, from the conversations that we've had with them, we've placed our factories as close to smallholder productivity belts as we possibly can. Because the farmers can't move the trees, but we can move the factories closer to the farmers.
How many factories are we talking about?
We have an ambition to set up well over 400 factories in Nigeria and well over 1,000 throughout the West African region. So we're basically working on our first one today and have raised this seed funding to develop West Africa's most advanced oil palm nut deshelling technology. But we're really excited about the opportunity to commercialize this technology and to put it in every farmer's backyard that has oil palm.
At the onset of the interview, we talked about how you and your colleagues are now part of the club, the Big Boys Club. Can you maybe share with us how you plan to spend some of this money that was raised?
So the use of this fundraise is basically to develop a proprietary piece of machinery for palm nut deshelling. So a lot of hardware research and development. And then the second aspect is to take that technology and to use it commercially with smallholder farmers. So that will also involve financing farmers, buying their palm nuts, which are the raw material for our machinery, and then processing it with our machinery. So we want to prove with this round of funding that we've been able to develop a proprietary piece of technology and operate it with a community of smallholders in a manner that is profitable to Relief, profitable to our suppliers, and impactful to the customers that we sell vegetable oil to.
How big is the Agritech industry in Nigeria?
It's a great question. So we focus specifically within the vegetable oil market. That's a $3 billion market in Nigeria. As you look at the ag tech market in Africa, there are a number of startups that are springing up in the space and are doing really well. Companies that come to mind are Afex, Twiga Foods, Babangona, and many others. And so we're seeing that there is more interest and focus in investing in ag tech. We think that the future of ag tech is in hybrid players like Relief that develops the technology, but then also owns and operates the technology and works with smallholder farmers. And we believe that this is the future of ag tech, is this hybrid in value chain approach to impacting value chains.
Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you for your time, Paul. This was great.
Great, Paul. That was Africa 54's tech correspondent Paul Ndeho speaking to Ikena Nziwi, CEO and co-founder of Relief in Lagos. And that's our show for today. Be sure to watch Africa 54 on our website at voaafrica.com. From all of us here in Washington, thanks for watching.